Elizabeth Marshall had always imagined that moving into her own house after the collapse of her marriage would finally allow her to breathe again, to step away from years of compromise and uncertainty, and live according to her own rhythm without the constant weight of someone else's choices pressing against her. The modest two-story home she purchased was not extravagant by any measure, but to her it was a sanctuary, a place where she could finally build a new routine, one filled with quiet evenings at the piano, slow mornings with coffee in the kitchen, filled by the smell of cedar cabinets and the gradual process of turning an empty structure into something personal. Her job as a music teacher rarely left her flush with money, but she was proud of having managed the down payment alone, proud of every paint stroke she applied to the walls, and proud even of the creaks in the floorboards, which seemed to her less like flaws and more like the natural imperfections of something alive. Neighbors were polite but distant, and although the Homeowners Association sent occasional letters about landscaping or trash pickup, Elizabeth paid little attention, assuming that such things were part of the dull but necessary background of suburban life. For weeks, she lived as if nothing could disturb the fragile cocoon she had created, convinced that at last the chaos of her past was behind her. One mild autumn evening, returning from her final class at the community center, Elizabeth noticed an envelope stuck into the frame of her mailbox rather than tucked properly inside. The heavy paper was cream-colored, embossed with the emblem of the HOA in sharp metallic ink, and although she found it pretentious, she assumed it was another circular about neighborhood events or new regulations on lawn height. Carrying it inside, she tossed it onto the kitchen counter with little thought, preoccupied with reheating leftovers and calling her sister. Only later, when she finally slit the envelope open, did her pulse quicken. The document inside was not a notice about gardening or recycling hours, but a strangely worded directive declaring that her property had been designated as a temporary community shelter under emergency provisions. There was no explanation of what. The emergency was no contact number apart from the HOA office, only a set of vague assurances that support personnel would assist with logistics. Elizabeth frowned, reading the paragraphs twice, then 3 times, trying to decide if it was some bureaucratic mistake, perhaps intended for a community center rather than a private residence. She placed the paper aside with irritation and decided to call in the morning to clarify. She had little chance. By the time darkness settled across the quiet street, Elizabeth noticed movement outside her window, shapes approaching not singly, but in groups, dragging suitcases, pushing strollers, even carrying bags of groceries as though preparing to stay for a long while. At first, she assumed it was some sort of neighborhood gathering spilling into the street, but then she saw the first figure walk directly toward her front path and pause expectantly at the door. When she opened it an inch, a middle-aged woman in a worn coat held out a sheet of paper with the HOA emblem printed at the top and said, almost apologetically, that they had been directed here as part of the emergency placement program. Elizabeth tried to explain that there must be an error, that this was her private home, but even as she spoke, more figures arrived behind the woman, a cluster of strangers shifting uncomfortably with luggage on the sidewalk. Their presence carried a weight that words could not dispel. She felt her mouth dry as she glanced at the sheet, which mirrored the notice she herself had received earlier that evening, down to the ornate signature of the HOA president. Within minutes, the quiet order of her life dissolved into confusion. Strangers loitered on her lawn, some staring at the windows, some setting down bags on the driveway as though already claiming territory. The night air filled with overlapping voices, questions about where they would sleep, muttered complaints about the delay, cries of tired children. Elizabeth stood frozen in the doorway, her heart hammering, realizing with growing dread that the document she had dismissed as absurd was in fact a prelude to something she could not yet comprehend. The sanctuary she had cherished only hours earlier was no longer untouched. It was being pulled away from her, not with violence but with an eerie inevitability, as though an invisible decision had already been made somewhere far beyond her reach, and now all she could do was watch the tide of strangers sweep toward her threshold, carrying with them the unraveling of everything she thought was secure. Elizabeth had always thought of herself as someone able to maintain control in stressful circumstances, yet nothing in her life had prepared her for the sight of strangers steadily pouring into the space she had painstakingly carved out for herself, treating her front porch as if it were a bus terminal and her living room as if it were already theirs by right. She tried at first to reason with them, asking where exactly they had come from and why they believed her house was a shelter, but the answers only deepened her confusion. One man explained that the HOA office had handed him a sheet with her address, printed clearly under the heading, Emergency Placement. A young mother said that the representative who directed her there had promised that all utilities would be covered, while an older man simply shrugged and said he did not know anything other. Then that this was where the program had sent him. Elizabeth's protestations that this was her home, that there had been a mistake, bounced off them like pebbles thrown at a stone wall, for every single one carried the same official paper, each stamped with the same emblem, each bearing the same signature, and all of them looked at her not as an owner whose boundaries had been violated, but as an obstacle to the relief they had been promised. She felt the weight of their eyes on her, felt herself slowly pushed backward by the tide of expectation until she was standing inside her own hallway, clutching the doorknob while figures crossed the threshold without waiting for her invitation, dragging rolling bags and plastic sacks of belongings across her freshly polished floor. At first, she thought perhaps she could call the police, that surely law enforcement would intervene to protect her property rights. Yet when she reached the dispatcher and described what was happening, the tone on the other end was not reassuring. The officer listened politely, then said in a measured voice that if the individuals in her home possessed documentation authorizing their placement there, even if she disputed its validity, it was a civil matter between her and the homeowners association, not something the police could resolve that night. Elizabeth tried to insist that it was madness, that strangers were literally moving into her home against her will, but the dispatcher only repeated that she should consult an attorney in the morning. Hanging up, she felt her chest tighten as the realization settled. She was alone with these people, without any official willing to help, trapped in her own living room while voices echoed up the staircase and footsteps explored the second floor. Bedrooms, as if they had always belonged there. The chaos of that first night etched itself into her memory like a scar. A tall man in a reflective vest appeared around 9 o'clock, carrying a clipboard and introducing himself as a coordinator, though he never provided a surname. He walked through her house with brisk authority, jotting notes, announcing that families would be placed upstairs while single men would take the basement, and advising Elizabeth that she could use the sofa in her own den if she wished to remain. On sight, when she tried to protest, he gave her a tight smile and gestured at the papers the others carried, reminding her that the HOA had already approved the arrangement. He did not threaten her, yet his calm insistence carried the force of something immovable, like bureaucracy wearing human skin, and for the first time she felt a flicker of fear that this was not a mistake at all, but a deliberate action sanctioned by someone with enough authority to sweep her objections aside. She retreated to the kitchen, watching in numb disbelief as bedding was spread across her hardwood floors, as the refrigerator door was opened without asking, as laughter and arguments mingled in the air until the house sounded like a boarding facility rather than a home. Sleep was impossible. Elizabeth sat at her dining table long after midnight, staring at the ornate letterhead of the notice she had received, tracing the embossed emblem with her fingertip as though the texture itself might reveal whether it was authentic. The name scrawled across the bottom, Craig Maddox, was familiar to her from the HOA newsletters, but she had never met the man in person, had never considered that a stranger with a title could suddenly dictate the most intimate aspects of her life. She imagined knocking on his office door the next morning, demanding an explanation, but the very thought made her stomach knot. Because what if this was intentional? What if the man who supposedly represented her neighborhood had in fact transformed? her house into a pawn in some larger scheme. The strangers in her living room were not criminals in the ordinary sense. They were weary, confused people who believed they had been granted permission to be there, which meant the true violation was not committed by them but by the authority that had pointed them to her doorstep. By dawn, her exhaustion was absolute, yet the noise of the house jolted her awake each time her eyes closed. Children argued in the hallway. A man boiled water in her kettle and spilled it across the stove. Another sat in her armchair scrolling through a phone with his shoes still on. Elizabeth wandered through the rooms like a ghost, whispering protests no one heard, and when she finally stepped outside for air, she saw that her front lawn had been littered with bags, shoes, even blankets hung across her shrubs to dry. Neighbors walked quickly past without pausing, some averting their eyes, others staring just long enough to register curiosity before moving on. No one offered help. She wanted to shout at them, to demand if they saw what was happening, but her voice caught in her throat because deep down she knew the answer. They did see, and they did not wish to be the next target. As the sun rose higher, the so-called coordinator returned, this time accompanied by two younger men in identical vests, both carrying plastic folders. They moved with a rehearsed efficiency, checking names, counting heads, and noting who had arrived overnight. Elizabeth tried to block their path, insisting that this was her home and that they had no right, but one of them simply handed her another copy of the same directive she had already received, as though the repetition of paper itself was enough to erase her voice. He explained with clipped politeness that the shelter designation would last until further notice, that she should direct any concerns to the HOA office, and that her cooperation was expected for the good of the community. She wanted to tear the sheet to pieces, to scream at them until the words shattered, yet the indifference in their expressions convinced her it would achieve nothing. They saw her not as a homeowner, not even as a person, but as a line in a file, a checkbox labeled occupied. That afternoon, standing at the window of what had once been her sanctuary, Elizabeth realized that the true catalyst had already unfolded. Her ownership meant nothing if an association could simply announce otherwise. Her protests carried no weight when confronted with paperwork bearing an official seal, and her home was no longer a refuge, but the stage of a battle she had never chosen to fight. Somewhere between the moment she slid open the envelope and the moment the first stranger carried a suitcase across her threshold, her life had tilted irrevocably, and she understood with chilling clarity that, until she uncovered who had orchestrated this and why, she would remain a prisoner in the very house she thought she had finally made her own. Elizabeth had promised herself during that first sleepless night that she would not allow the chaos to continue for long, that by the following day she would confront whoever was responsible and demand an explanation. Yet, as the hours bled into one, she discovered that her resolve collided with a bureaucracy so cold and unyielding it seemed almost designed to exhaust her before she even had the chance to speak. She arrived at the HOA office early, clutching the notice that had upended her life, only to be greeted by a receptionist who barely looked up from her screen. And when Elizabeth tried to explain that her home had been invaded, the woman responded with an expression of mild boredom and said she would need to make an appointment with the president, Craig Maddox. The first available slot, she added, was in 2 weeks. Elizabeth felt her pulse rise and demanded to see him immediately, but the receptionist repeated her line with a glazed smile, as though reading from a script. Only when Elizabeth raised her voice did another door open, and a tall man in a charcoal suit emerged with the slow confidence of someone accustomed to others waiting for him. Maddox introduced himself calmly, invited her into a narrow office, and gestured for her to sit, his demeanor suggesting that everything about this meeting was routine. Elizabeth, still trembling with anger, laid the papers on his desk and demanded to know on what authority the HOA had declared her house a shelter, why strangers had been directed into her private space, and how such an absurd decision could possibly be justified. Maddox listened with what appeared to be patience but was in fact a studied detachment. the faint smile never leaving his lips. He explained in a tone that reminded her of a lecture addressing inattentive students that recent community regulations had been updated to include provisions for emergency housing in extraordinary circumstances, and that her property, due to its location and available space, had been deemed suitable. Elizabeth interrupted to say that no such provisions existed in the official HOA charter, which she had already reviewed line by line the previous night, but Maddox simply spread his hands and said that bylaws were living documents subject to revision. When she pointed out that she had never received any notice of these supposed revisions, he shrugged and remarked that notices had been distributed electronically and posted on the community website. Elizabeth countered that none of the neighbors she had spoken with had seen them either, but Maddox leaned back in his chair and remarked, with a trace of condescension, that most residents did not pay close attention until matters affected them. Personally, the casual dismissal made her blood boil. Yet worse was the implication that the law was on his side, that whether or not she agreed, her objections would dissolve against the weight of procedure. She demanded to know how long the strangers would be permitted to occupy her house, but Maddox gave only vague assurances about temporary measures and the importance of community solidarity. When she insisted on the immediate removal of the occupants, he leaned forward, folding his hands, and in a voice just soft enough to chill her, remarked that it would be unwise to create hostility with the HOA, since cooperation always benefited residents in the long run. Elizabeth stared at him in disbelief, hearing not advice but a veiled warning, the suggestion that resistance would cost her more than endurance. She rose abruptly, refusing his handshake, and left the office feeling as though the ground beneath her had shifted once again, as though she had spoken not to a representative but to the architect of the entire intrusion. Returning home, she found the situation had worsened. Furniture had been rearranged, her dining table shoved against a wall to make space for sleeping mats, and her piano, her most precious possession, was covered with a blanket to serve as an improvised shelf for bags. Strangers greeted her not with gratitude, but with the entitled ease of tenants, asking where extra blankets were stored or when the hot water would be fixed, as if she were their landlord rather than the owner fighting to reclaim her home. She attempted to assert boundaries, telling them firmly that they were not authorized to remain, but one of the men, the same who had acted as a coordinator the night before, stepped between her and the others with a polite but final tone, saying that until the HOA communicated otherwise, the arrangement was to remain. Elizabeth realized with a jolt that he carried himself less like a volunteer and more like an enforcer, his eyes scanning the room not for comfort but for control. That evening, as she sat on the small corner of her sofa, still left unoccupied, Elizabeth overheard fragments of conversation that deepened her dread. Two of the men argued in low voices about who would be allowed to stay upstairs and who had to remain in the basement, their tone not of temporary guests but of people settling territory. Another complained bitterly about having been moved from a different house across town, implying that her property was only the latest in a series of appropriated residences. When Elizabeth confronted him, asking what he meant, he glanced at her with a sneer and muttered that the HOA had promised they would not be shuffled again, that this house was supposed to be stable for at least a month. The word month lodged in her chest like a stone. She demanded to know who had told him this, but he turned away, unwilling to answer. As night fell, the noise grew unbearable. Television blaring, children crying, voices rising in arguments she could not follow. Elizabeth retreated to her bedroom, locking the door, but even there she was not safe, for someone knocked repeatedly around midnight, demanding extra pillows. She shouted for them to leave her alone, and when silence finally returned, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, heart pounding, realizing she could not endure another night like this. The intrusion was no longer a bureaucratic mistake to be corrected, but a deliberate occupation sanctioned by those meant to protect homeowners. Her house had been converted into something alien, and her life, once carefully rebuilt after years of hardship, was unraveling with every step strangers took across her floors. By morning, she made a decision. If Maddox believed she would collapse under pressure, if the HOA expected her to accept the role of unwilling host, then they had miscalculated. Elizabeth resolved to fight, no matter how tangled the legal maze became. What she did not yet understand was that the maze had been designed precisely to trap people like her, and that with each attempt to reclaim what was hers, the association would escalate, not with violence but with quiet manipulations, far more corrosive. Her first attempt to assert herself had already failed, and as she watched one of the strangers watering his plants in her backyard with her hose as though he owned the place, Elizabeth realized the battle for her home had only just begun. Elizabeth had begun to suspect that her house was not chosen by accident, but rather targeted with intent. And the more she observed the behavior of those planted inside her walls, the more she realized that the supposed shelter designation masked something far more deliberate and calculated. Days blended together, filled with the exhausting rhythm of strangers moving through her kitchen, occupying her living room, and treating her furniture as if it were common property, yet through the noise and disruption she noticed patterns. One man always lingered near the front window taking notes in a small ledger. Another insisted on collecting names from the others as if he were in charge of a registry, while a woman she had barely spoken to regularly slipped out the back door at night only, to return hours later without explanation. Elizabeth's fear transformed slowly into suspicion, and she understood that if she was to regain her home, she needed proof of what was happening, something more than her word against the association's polished statements. One afternoon, unable to bear the tension any longer, she drove downtown to the county records office, a stack of HOA documents clutched in her bag. The clerk, a tired man in his 60s, listened politely as she explained that her home had been seized under the guise of emergency housing, then raised his eyebrows when she handed him the letter bearing Maddox's signature. After several minutes searching the database, he shook his head, telling her there was no such ordinance on record authorizing the HOA to commandeer private residences. When Elizabeth showed him the notarized attachments that had been circulated among the occupants, the man frowned more deeply and muttered that the notary listed had passed away months earlier. Elizabeth felt her pulse quicken, recognizing at once that this was the crack she had been hoping for. The documents were not only questionable but demonstrably fraudulent. The clerk, though unwilling to get directly involved, quietly suggested she speak with a lawyer who specialized in property law, slipping her the name of someone he trusted, Martin Blake. Blake's office was cramped, stacked high with folders, but the man himself radiated an energy of calm competence. He listened to her story without interruption, examining the documents with meticulous care, and after a long silence remarked that she was indeed facing a serious breach of property rights, one that went beyond a mere misunderstanding. He explained that the HOA had no legal authority to seize private homes for shelter purposes, and that the forged notary stamp was more than a clerical issue. It was potential evidence of intentional fraud. When Elizabeth asked why Maddox would risk such a blatant deception, Blake leaned back and suggested that it was likely part of a scheme to secure outside funding. Emergency housing programs often attracted grants, subsidies, or donations, and if the HOA could present paperwork showing that properties were being used for humanitarian purposes, they could claim significant sums of money without ever spending a cent of their own. Elizabeth felt sick as she considered it. Her sanctuary reduced to a pawn in a financial scam. Her privacy stripped away not because of community need, but because someone saw profit in her suffering. Returning home with Blake's reassurances that they would prepare a legal challenge, she found her house in even greater disarray. Someone had moved her piano into the garage to make more sleeping space, a decision that left her trembling with rage, while the so-called coordinator greeted her with a patronizing tone, remarking that adjustments were necessary and that she should not interfere with the arrangement. Elizabeth shouted that the HOA had no right, that she had already spoken to a lawyer, but the man only smirked and suggested she take up her grievances at the next community meeting. That night, unable to sleep once again, she overheard two of the strangers whispering near the staircase about payment schedules and reimbursement, words that confirmed what Blake had told her. They had been promised stipends for participating, as if their very presence in her home was part of a carefully organized program. The following morning, Elizabeth confronted the woman who often disappeared at night, catching her just as she returned through the back door. The woman, startled, dropped a folder she was carrying, and as papers spilled across the floor, Elizabeth glimpsed forms bearing both the HOA emblem and the seal of a local charity she had never heard of. When she demanded to know what this meant, the woman panicked, stuffing the papers back together and muttering that she was just doing what she was told. Elizabeth pressed harder, and eventually the woman admitted in a shaking voice that she had been recruited with the promise of payment for monitoring conditions inside the shelter homes, that she was expected to file regular reports about the residents and the homeowners' behavior. The realization that she herself had become an object of observation made Elizabeth's skin crawl. Not only had her property been stolen, her very life inside her house was being documented, her resistance measured like data in a file. That night, Elizabeth gathered the courage to meet with a few neighbors she trusted, inviting them discreetly to her backyard. At first, they were hesitant, glancing nervously over their shoulders, but when she explained what she had learned, the false notary, the hidden payments, the spying, they admitted that rumors had been spreading for weeks. Other houses in nearby developments had been similarly designated, their owners pressured into silence or bought off with small settlements. One neighbor confessed that he had received a letter threatening increased HOA dues if he raised objections. Another said she had noticed unfamiliar cars parked near her driveway for nights on end after she questioned Maddox's decisions. It became clear that Elizabeth was not an isolated case but part of a larger strategy, and that the HOA had woven a net of intimidation around the community to keep people compliant. As she listened to their whispered accounts under the dim porch light, Elizabeth felt the first flicker of hope since the ordeal began. If she could gather their testimonies and combine them with the evidence Blake was assembling, she might have a chance not only to reclaim her house but to expose the corruption festering beneath the veneer of suburban order. Yet she also knew that by stepping forward she was placing herself in direct opposition to Maddox and those who profited alongside him, and that they would not surrender easily. When she returned inside, the coordinator was sitting calmly in her armchair, as if he had been waiting for her, and when their eyes met, he smiled faintly and remarked, "You should be careful what you share with others. People might misunderstand." Elizabeth closed the door behind her and stood in silence, her heart pounding. It was no longer a question of whether the HOA had overstepped. It was a battle of endurance, of whether she could outlast the web of lies that had been spun around her. She was not naive enough to believe the road ahead would be easy, but for the first time she had a clear picture of the enemy. A network of deception built on paper, stamps, and signatures, all designed to look official while hollow at the core. And with that clarity came determination. She would not let them bury her beneath their paperwork. She would fight, even if it meant dragging their secrets into the light one document at a time. Elizabeth had assumed that once she uncovered the fraudulent documents and secured the help of Martin Blake, the balance of power would begin to shift. Yet within days, she realized that the association was prepared to escalate in ways she had not anticipated, tightening their grip with measures that blurred the line between bureaucratic formality and outright intimidation. The first sign came in the form of a bright yellow envelope taped to her front door, declaring in bold print that she was being fined for failure to provide adequate accommodations for temporary residents. The list of violations was absurd: insufficient bedding, inadequate hot water, lack of proper signage, and yet each carried a monetary penalty that, when added together, exceeded $3,000. Elizabeth tore the paper from the door in fury, but when she showed it to Blake, he only sighed and explained that such tactics were common. The association knew the fines were unenforceable in the long term, yet their purpose was to overwhelm her, with fear of financial ruin before she could bring the case to court. The harassment did not stop at paperwork. Late one evening, she returned from a meeting with Blake to find two men in vests standing on her porch, casually smoking while blocking the entrance. When she demanded to know what they were doing, they replied with infuriating calm that they had been assigned as safety monitors for the shelter program and would be stationed there indefinitely. Elizabeth's protest that they were trespassing on private property was met with a shrug and the suggestion that she could call the HOA if she had concerns. From that night forward, they loitered outside like sentinels, speaking little but always watching, their presence a reminder that her every move was under scrutiny. Strangers still roamed her rooms freely, and the coordinator had grown bolder, moving her belongings into boxes under the pretense of creating space. When she tried to stop him, he simply produced another sheet of paper, stamped and signed, stating that the association had authorized temporary reorganization of assets. The phrasing chilled her because it treated her possessions not as personal property, but as resources belonging to the program. As the days dragged on, Elizabeth noticed fractures among the so-called residents. Some had grown restless and resentful, whispering that the payments they were promised were late, while others argued over territory within the house. She overheard one man accuse another of taking bribes from the HOA to keep order, and though the accused denied it, the tension was palpable. One evening, a fight broke out in her kitchen, dishes shattering as two men shouted and shoved each other until the coordinator intervened, threatening to report them to Maddox. Elizabeth tried to use the chaos to her advantage, speaking quietly with a few who seemed genuinely trapped by the arrangement. A middle-aged woman confided that she had been told the shelter program was voluntary and that she could leave at any time. Yet, when she tried to return home, she found her own locks changed and an HOA notice declaring her property under inspection. Others admitted similar stories, each one suggesting that the association had systematically displaced people, shuffling them like pieces on a board to create the appearance of a functioning humanitarian project. Despite the growing unrest inside the house, Maddox's control outside remained absolute. Elizabeth received another envelope, this time warning that legal action would be pursued against her for obstructing community welfare initiatives. She felt her anger rise to the point of nausea, knowing the language was designed to paint her as selfish, a villain against her own neighborhood. Worse, neighbors had begun avoiding her altogether, some crossing the street when she approached, others offering only forced smiles. She suspected Maddox had been whispering in their ears, framing her as the obstacle to relief, a woman refusing to share her abundance in a time of need. The isolation was nearly unbearable, yet Elizabeth forced herself to keep moving, gathering testimonies from the residents who trusted her and copying every fraudulent paper she could find. Blake encouraged her, reminding her that the weight of evidence was building, that once in court Maddox's entire scheme would collapse, but Elizabeth knew they had to survive long enough to reach that day. The pressure mounted until one night she awoke to the sound of splintering wood. Rushing downstairs, she discovered that the back door had been forced open and that boxes of her personal items, photographs, sheet music, family heirlooms, were scattered across the porch. When she demanded to know who was responsible, the coordinator appeared from the shadows and coolly stated that the HOA had ordered an inventory of her assets to ensure fair distribution among residents. Elizabeth felt her body tremble with fury, but before she could respond, one of the hired monitors stepped forward and told her to calm down, his tone carrying the quiet threat of someone who believed he could silence her if necessary. She retreated upstairs, barricading herself in her bedroom, clutching her phone with white knuckles as she debated whether to call the police again, but she knew what the answer would be. Civil dispute, take it to court. She was beginning to understand the cruel elegance of Maddox's design. Never enough violence to provoke immediate law enforcement, only layers of paperwork, intimidation, and manipulation that looked official on the surface but hollow underneath. The next morning she resolved that she could not wait passively for the court date to arrive. She needed to act, to push back against the suffocating grip of the association. She met once more with her small circle of neighbors willing to resist, urging them to speak openly about their experiences, to break the silence Maddox depended upon. Yet, even as she planned her next move, she felt the walls closing in tighter, the pressure growing more unbearable, and she realized with grim clarity that the escalation was far from its peak. Maddox and the HOA had shown they were willing to bend every rule to maintain their scheme, and Elizabeth understood that the fight for her home had entered its most dangerous stage, a battle not only for property, but for the right to live without, fear inside the very walls she had once called her refuge. Elizabeth knew the confrontation could not be delayed any longer, and when Martin Blake finally confirmed that their injunction had been accepted and a court hearing scheduled, she felt a surge of relief mixed with a terror so sharp it seemed to lodge beneath her ribs. The day she walked into the courthouse, the house she once cherished still throbbed with noise from strangers. Her possessions remained in boxes as if waiting for a new owner, and the association's monitors still loitered outside. But for the first time she sensed that the narrative was about to be wrestled from Maddox's carefully manicured hands. The courtroom itself was unremarkable. Fluorescent lights humming above, rows of wooden benches polished by years of nervous bodies, but the stakes lent every detail a weight that made the air heavy. Maddox arrived flanked by two attorneys in sleek suits, their expressions carrying the smug assurance of men certain their paper trail would outmatch any protest, while Elizabeth sat beside Blake clutching a folder of evidence that felt both fragile and explosive. The proceedings began with Maddox's attorneys painting her as unstable, a homeowner who had misunderstood community protocols, a woman resistant to the spirit of solidarity. They waved copies of supposed bylaws that granted the HOA sweeping emergency powers, citing phrases so vague they seemed almost written to justify anything. Elizabeth clenched her fists beneath the table, feeling the heat of their contempt as they described her as selfish, unwilling to share her abundance with those in need. Yet when Blake rose, his calm voice carried a steadiness that cut through their rhetoric. He presented the county clerk's testimony that no such ordinances existed, laid out the death certificate of the notary whose seal adorned dozens of HOA documents, and introduced the residents themselves, several of whom had agreed, trembling but resolute, to testify that they were promised stipends and instructed to occupy her house under false pretenses. One by one, their accounts exposed the program not as humanitarian relief, but as an organized deception designed to siphon funds from external grants. The turning point came when Blake unveiled a packet of emails obtained through discovery, correspondence between Maddox and a shadowy intermediary promising substantial payments in exchange for providing shelter statistics. The language was damning. Numbers of beds filled, duration of occupancy, photographs of interiors, all fabricated or coerced from unwilling homeowners like Elizabeth. Maddox's mask of calm cracked for the first time, his jaw tightening as Blake read aloud a line in which Maddox explicitly referred to residents as assets and homeowners as barriers to compliance. Murmurs rippled across the courtroom, and even the judge's expression hardened. Maddox's attorneys tried to object, claiming the emails were taken out of context, but the judge overruled them, demanding further explanation. When Maddox finally spoke, his polished confidence faltered, his words stumbling as he attempted to recast the scheme as a well-intentioned effort that had merely been mismanaged. The performance collapsed beneath the weight of evidence, and Elizabeth felt her throat tighten with something close to triumph as she realized the narrative had shifted irreversibly. The judge's ruling was firm and unambiguous. The designation of Elizabeth's house as an emergency shelter was void. The occupants were to be relocated immediately, and the HOA's actions would be referred to the district attorney for investigation into fraud and forgery, Compensation for damages and legal costs was awarded to Elizabeth, though the numbers meant less to her than the recognition, the official affirmation that what she had endured was unlawful. As the gavel fell, the courtroom erupted in whispers, reporters scribbling, residents shaking hands, and Blake leaning close to whisper that this was only the beginning, that the investigation could unravel years of misconduct. Elizabeth sat frozen for a moment, absorbing the reality that the house she thought she had lost was hers again, that the strangers would finally leave, and that Maddox, once so untouchable, now stood exposed under the same sterile lights that had once seemed to favor him. When she left the courthouse, the monitors who had haunted her porch were gone, their presence dissolved like smoke, and for the first time in weeks she breathed without the metallic taste of fear. She knew the fight had scarred her, that the memories of violation and helplessness would linger, but she also knew she had faced down an edifice of power built on intimidation and lies, and she had not been broken. The climax was not the end of her ordeal, but the moment she proved to herself that she was capable of reclaiming what was hers. And as the courthouse doors closed behind her, she felt the fragile but undeniable weight of victory settle on her shoulders. Elizabeth returned to her house with the court order still warm in her hands, and for the first time in many weeks the threshold felt like it belonged to her again, though the silence inside was not the silence she had once cherished but a heavy echo of what had been endured. The strangers were gone, their bedding and makeshift furniture removed in haste, yet the scars of their presence remained in scuffed floors, broken dishes, and the faint lingering smell of too many bodies pressed together in spaces never meant to hold them. She walked slowly from room to room, touching the surfaces as if to reassure herself that they were real, pausing longest before the piano in the garage, its cover slightly torn, its keys silent and waiting. Moving it back into its place became her first deliberate act of reclamation, and when the instrument finally stood once more in the corner of the living room, she lowered her hands onto the keys and pressed a chord that filled the house with a sound that was hers alone. Neighbors who had kept their distance began to approach in small ways, some with hesitant apologies, others with offers to help repair what had been damaged. And though Elizabeth knew their silence during her ordeal had been a form of complicity, she accepted their gestures, not out of forgiveness, but because she understood that fear had governed them as surely as it had imprisoned her. Together, they began to talk of change, of forming an independent committee to replace the dissolved HOA, of ensuring that such exploitation could not be repeated. And Elizabeth, though reluctant at first, found herself at the center of those conversations. She realized that her fight had given others the courage to voice what they had endured in quieter ways, fines that had made no sense, threats disguised as notices, a creeping loss of autonomy that no one had dared challenge until she did. At night, she still sometimes woke in panic, imagining footsteps in the hall or voices arguing in the kitchen, but gradually the house softened again, the walls absorbing her presence rather than that of intruders. The ordeal had stripped her illusions about safety, but it had also revealed a resilience she had not known she possessed, and in the quiet after the storm she discovered a steadier kind of peace. Elizabeth no longer thought of the house as merely a sanctuary from the past. It had become proof that even against a system built on intimidation and deceit, one voice could endure long enough to be heard. And when she sat once more at her piano and played into the night, the music carried through the rooms not as an echo of survival, but as a declaration that the home was hers and would remain so.